Thank you very much, Konstantinos, and thank you to UEA Climate for inviting me to speak today. I'm very excited and honoured to be part of this community. Well, morning, everybody. I've got just 10 minutes or so just to say really a few fun sort of introductory observations about the project I'm engaged with this year. And of course, it is about climate. It's actually about the conservation, if you like, the extinction crisis to some extent. But I thought I'd start with just kind of, if you like, sharing an account of the extremely difficult year I've had, just like I'm sure everybody here has had a particularly difficult year this year to do any research or to do, frankly, anything at all. So this time last year, I was about to, well, it really was March 2020, and I had in sight the notion that I was about to kind of have a revival of the plays that Konstantinos just alluded to, the contingency plan. So back in 2008, 2009, I wrote a double bill of plays that featured at the Bush Theatre in London, a very small theatre actually, but a theatre with a large reach, and it was called the Contingency Plan. And in some respects, even though it was probably seen by 3,000 people maximum, it's established me as a writer in an environmental space trying to address the climate crisis at a point when actually nobody really called it the climate crisis, even though we've discovered it really was a crisis waiting really just around the corner. And so this time last year, I was anticipating a major revival. It was going to be at the Dolmar Warehouse in London. It was going to be at Theatre Clwyd in Wales, had a really good starry cast. We'd literally got the design, everything was ready to go. First day of rehearsal, March 21st. But you can probably guess what happened next. It didn't happen. It was cancelled. And I tell you, it's a sort of extraordinary, useful experience in some respects, because it's a helpful way into a world where nothing can be depended upon. And also an interesting experience in which one's platform is completely removed. You're going to be talking a little bit about advocacy as kind of researchers and climate researchers later on. Well, obviously, my space for advocacy is the theatre and indeed other media too. What happens when your platform disappears? Well, fortunately, at the very same time, an email arrived to me from the Arts and Humanities Research Council telling me that I'd been successful in a grant application. The grant application was to their scheme, let me get this right, it was something called Leadership Fellowship Scheme. And the core of that task was the idea of trying to bring together drama and conservation. And if we can go to the next slide, please, let me just say a little bit about the shape of this. And one thing that I've been carrying forward through the entire year is the idea that maybe there is a kind of kinship between the sort of work that some of you, particularly in the sciences, do and the sort of work that I might be doing and others in the arts. Particularly when you're undertaking a project of this nature, it will not proceed according to plan. Nothing in the arts proceeds according to plan. That's kind of a central way of defining artistic activity, I think. So I was very struck by this quotation from Edward O. Wilson's book, Half Earth, which was one of the first things I read during this project. Trying to kind of get my head around contemporary debates in conservation. Wilson is claiming that really, if we're going to kind of sustain life on this planet, we need to give over an enormous amount of it to the natural world, to non-human species. But I actually took out of it this fascinating account he gives of his own research practice, where he talks about scientific research being seldom straightforward. It rarely takes major leaps straight to the top. It moves obliquely. And if nothing else, I've discovered how to move obliquely this year, pressing forward at angles, reformulating, twisting, filling the subject out, waiting, looking around, describing parts exactly, describing causal lineage more firmly. Then, like the crack in the cave wall, a guiding beam of light comes through. What a beautiful account of any work. But I think in some respects, it absolutely nails the process that I've undertaken in creating Song of the Reeds. Next slide, please, Julia. So what was I trying to address in this project? Well, I suppose I was trying to address a problem in storytelling, a problem that's made even more acute with the climate crisis and indeed the ancillary crisis within the natural world, the so-called sixth extinction that some speak of, such as Elizabeth Kolbert. I've always felt that, you know, after Shakespeare, and certainly the Western tradition of theatre, nature gradually disappears, just like it disappears from most of lives in Western countries during that sort of 400 years of modernity. Theatre particularly is culpable of being described, as Nietzsche said, as all too human. Its focus is increasingly on the social and the human to the exclusion of everything else. And in fact, there are some exceptions to this rule. Oddly enough, many of them are associated with a movement in the arts called naturalism in the 19th century, very inspired by Darwin. And often many of those writers are in fact themselves physiologists, natural scientists. Buchner, Chekhov obviously was a doctor, Strindberg was a biologist, and drew inspiration from the sciences. But even there, where natural world appears, it appears as a kind of denuded symbol, as a dead seagull, as a sort of wild duck trapped in an attic, as a sort of unseen cherry orchard. And how could we reverse those terms was one of the things I wanted to explore rather hubristically in my project, 18-month project. Can I have the next slide, please? So one of the ways I wanted to try and do this was to get as local as possible. And I live actually in Cambridgeshire rather than in Norfolk. So for a very long time, I've had a very close relationship with probably the most iconic and essential nature reserve, not only in the UK, but in the world, which is Wycombe Fen, just about 15 miles northeast of me. The cradle, actually, of the science of ecology. After all, this was the sort of stamping ground of Charles Darwin, Arthur Tansley, the Godwins, Max Walter, Norman Moore. So it's actually a place, it's one of 3 undrained relict fenlands in Cambridgeshire. It's like a tiny percentage left of that area, which is this kind of environment. But it's also not just about the past. Wycombe Fen's about the future, because National Trust in the turn of the century announced an intention to grow and grow and grow and extend the fen to the outskirts of Cambridge. It's actually about 15% in on that journey now. So we're looking at both the sort of classical conservation, attempt to control an environment and maintain it as it has been through the last few centuries, and another type of environment, which is to transform the denuded agricultural landscape around it. Next slide, please. So one of the first things you notice with these environments is that they are reed bed environments, hence Song of the Reed. By the way, Song of the Reed alludes to a poet, Rumi. It's a kind of part of his long, he's a Persian poet from 11th century, part of his long epic poem, the Masnavi, begins with a kind of introduction where the reed sings, the reed being a kind of cut from the reed bed to form a flute. And I was just so struck by the, if you like, universality of the reed bed, that wherever there's wetlands, wherever there's deltas, you will find reeds en masse. And there's something about the sort of the gathered assembly of the reed bed, the kind of almost human nature of reeds, that kind of I found so compelling as an environment. But also the first thing you notice when you go into an environment and talk to people who work there, and the picture there shows a guy called Stuart Warrington, who used to be the sort of environmental advisor at Wycombe, is that it's a managed environment. Clearly it's a managed environment. If the reed beds were allowed to do what they allowed to succeed in Tansley's terminology, they would quickly become dried out, they would become wet woodland, and then the reeds would be gone, and the 9,000 or even 10,000 species that harbour in their midst would be lost. So next slide. The other environment was Strumpshaw Fen, which will be very familiar to some of you if you live near Norwich. Obviously, it's about 7-8 miles east of Norwich. And the reason I love Strumpshaw anyway. It's a smaller reserve. It has rather less profile. It's only more recently acquired. Actually, it was founded in 1975 by the AHRC. And I think that the different organisations themselves become part of the object of study here, because the National Trust relationship to environmental conservation is a very different one from the RSPB's relationship, which obviously is particularly species driven. So how do you make a drama out of a crisis, if you like, the ecological crisis, the conservation crisis? Well, one way is to get other people on board. And if I can have the next slide, please. I wanted to sort of work with different platforms with this. And in a year in which theatre has effectively been cancelled, certainly indoor theatre, it struck me that a smart move was to lean into something that I had a reasonable reputation within, which was radio writing, radio drama. But radio drama is, notoriously undersung and, often sort of neglected. It's a sort of ubiquitous thing. I mean, the average radio play of an afternoon reaches at least 1 million people. So it has a very large audience comparable to theatre, which probably reaches a fraction of that, but gets, an infinite more amount of attention. So how to create a radio drama that didn't go unnoticed and did catch people's attention. So I pitched this notion of the Song of the Reed as a 4-part seasonal drama to Radio 4. Almost, if you like, in the light of seasons and programs like Spring Watch and so forth. I even used the sort of hubristic phase. This will be to conservation what the Archers is to agriculture. The idea that it would be very rooted in actual practice, real places. It would follow the practical work of conservation through the seasons, and that it would invert that notion of nature as a background. Nature would become a foreground by means of the so-called guest species, if you like, the species of the day for each episode. So episode 1 focuses on Norfolk's perhaps most famous and most iconic creature, the swallowtail butterfly, which, by the way, used to also be extant in Cambridgeshire and Wycombe Fen, but vanished in the 1950s and was never reintroduced. There was 2 or 3 attempts to reintroduce it, all of which failed. Next episode will be, oh, can we go back? Sorry, will be, I've slightly misspelt it there. The little whirlpool ram's horn snail will be the sort of dramatic fulcrum of episode 2, which goes out in September, and we're going to be recording in August. So it's very site specific. It's recorded in the space that it's about, although in fact I've invented an invented nature reserve called Flegwick, even though it's recorded in Strumpshaw. And the story is, if you like, rather like the story of another nature reserve, which is across the River Yare, Wheatfen Reserve, in the sense that that's a kind of, should we say, a private reserve founded in that case by very famous Norfolk naturalist Ted Ellis. So my story, we see on the left here Sophia Caneda, who plays Liv, who's the daughter of a famous naturalist called Max Godwin, who's now died, and she's returned, and she's got to find out how to manage this environment of Flegwick Fen. And her ally and her obstacle in this task is the warden of many years, Ian George, played by Mark Rylance on the right. So obviously, I'm being very cool about having Mark Rylance and Sophia Caneda in my drama, but I can assure you I wasn't when I realised that they were going to do it. And, you know, of course, the profile of the actors has been really significant in the interest and the noise around this episode. And Mark, perhaps particularly because not only is he, you know, let's be honest, one of the greatest actors of our time, he's also, you know, hugely involved in environmentalism. Now, I see that my time is basically up. I want to just say one last thing, if I may, Tracy. Can we just go to the next slide? So, final point to say that I also wanted to centre the project on a work of theatre, and I'm working with outdoor theatre company Tangled Feet. And the reason I'm flagging this up is that the next work coming out of Song of the Reed will be called Murmuration, and it will be an in situ guided walk into the 2 nature reserves in September. I'd love you all to come. But the other thing to be said about it is, in some respects, it reverses the terms. It becomes about the human need for nature in natural environments. So the 2 projects are complementary. So now I will hand back to the chair, because obviously we have a lot of wonderful presentations coming our way. But thank you for listening, and do contact me if you've got any further questions about Song of the Reed.